Hey, look what happened. Is this crazy? This will truly be the golden age of America. That's what we have to have.
The world needs China and the United States to work together for a better future.
Hello and welcome to a special US election edition of the Bloomberg Australia podcast, coming to you on Thursday, November 7. Donald Trump is headed back to the White House, and high on his to-do list will be keeping China in check as both superpowers race for tech supremacy. What challenges has Trump inherited? What is his plan? Will it work? And what will that mean for us? Hello, I'm Rebecca Jones and welcome to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. Today on the show, the world is increasingly driving Chinese electric vehicles, using Chinese smartphones, powering our homes with Chinese solar panels, and despite a campaign of tariffs, export controls and restrictions, some kicked off by Trump himself, the US is struggling to contain China's rise. Today, we're going to dive deep into the relationship between the US and China, what the election outcome will mean for competition between the world's two superpowers, and what it means for Australia. To help me do that, I'm joined today by Malcolm Scott. Mal is Bloomberg's International Economics Enterprise Editor based in Sydney. Mal, you just worked on some analysis from Bloomberg that drilled down into whether or not the US efforts over the last couple of years to keep China in check have actually worked. Tell me, what did you find out?
We took a look at the Made in China 2025 industrial policy blueprint that was unveiled about a decade ago. And we looked at the 13 key technologies that have been tracked by Bloomberg researchers and found that China has actually already achieved a global leadership position in 5 of those key technologies. Things like EVs, batteries, they're doing so well at solar panels. And they're catching up fast in 7 of the others. So the only one that they're really behind in and still look a little behind in is commercial aircraft. Now, put all that together, and it tells us that this effort by both the Biden administration and the Trump administration before it to really actively contain China's economic advance hasn't worked so far. There have been some successes. The US trade deficit with China is down from $382 billion in 2018 when Trump first imposed tariffs on China to $259 billion, these are US dollars, last year. But overall, that broader goal to keep America a few steps ahead of China's economy doesn't really seem to be working.
And as you say, this is a challenge that the new president, the incoming president, Donald Trump, is going to inherit. Joe Biden's approach has been, as you said, to prevent China from getting access to the tools and machinery it needs to move ahead, particularly when it comes to things like semiconductors. I guess the unique thing about China is that it is one of those things that both sides of politics have agreed on in the US. Mel, what do we actually know about how Trump plans to approach Beijing now he's headed back to the Oval Office?
Well, where the Biden administration were prioritizing things like industrial incentives to lure big companies back to US shores, there was the Inflation Reduction Act, there was the CHIPS Act. We have Donald Trump pledging to do so with tariffs. So he's basically saying, hey, come back to America or else we're going to slap you with hefty tariffs. In the case of China, he's threatening tariffs of 60% right across the board from all of those Chinese exports to the United States. Now, Bloomberg Economics has done some studies on that, assuming some tit-for-tat retaliation by China. They say if that were actually to happen, trade between those two economic superpowers would effectively grind to a halt. Let's not forget that Trump is also threatening tariffs on others, including allies. So, it's going to be a complex web. And of course, we have to look, does he actually deliver on these threats? Or do folks like Elon Musk get in his ear and say, hey, buddy, we've got some pretty serious business interests in China. Perhaps we can moderate those. Remember that Tim Cook of Apple was effective in doing that in the first Trump presidency. So look, there's a lot that can happen here. These threats of across-the-board tariffs may not be delivered, but economists have already started to crunch the numbers and they don't look good.
Yeah, I mean, that's my next question. Will these tariffs, if they are enacted, actually work to contain China's economic rise?
there could be some success in some spots. For instance, there has already been success in the chip space. It is thought that the Biden administration's efforts have managed to keep the United States a couple of steps ahead in the very pointy end of the semiconductor manufacturing space. But overall, there's been a bigger impetus for China to double down on these industrial policies. It really needs self-sufficiency in tech, it's learning. And some of the companies are saying, you know what, we don't really need the United States after all. Let's take BYD as an example. So China's top-selling automaker, it is expecting overseas deliveries to account for almost half of total sales in the future. But guess what? It's bypassing the United States. It's making factories and investing in factories in Thailand, building similar ones in Hungary, Brazil, Turkey. And Stella Lee, BYD Executive Vice President, says, quote, we don't need to enter the US market. So there really is a risk here that the United States ends up isolating itself with these tariffs rather than China.
And have you been outside the bureau lately? There's a few BYDs driving around Sydney and Melbourne, right?
Absolutely. We're seeing more and more.
Why is the US taking such a hard line against China, Mel? What are they really concerned about here? Is it just tech supremacy for tech supremacy's sake?
I mean, that's part of it. They want to still be the world's biggest economy, but it's very much tied to the strategic imperative of maintaining military dominance over its biggest challenger. And, you know, they've been quite explicit in saying as much. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor to Biden, in a 2022 speech, was very direct. He said, look, we're outlining this series of technologies, things like semiconductors, clean energy, biotech, and we want to maintain as large a lead as possible in those. He called export controls a strategic asset. And he said the US is imposing those on adversaries, quote, to degrade their battlefield capabilities. So there really is this very close link between these industrial policies and the military stance.
It doesn't get more plain speaking than that, does it? When we come back, we ask, what does this race for supremacy between the world's two biggest economies mean for Australia?
Trade supports 1 in 4 Australian jobs, and China remains overwhelmingly Australia's largest trading partner. Australian farmers, miners and exporters are already seeing the benefits from the removal of trade impediments, benefits that flow throughout our economy.
And welcome back to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. I'm Rebecca Jones, joined today by Malcolm Scott, Bloomberg's international editor based in Sydney. We just heard their remarks from the Aussie PM Anthony Albanese at a joint press conference in Canberra with the visiting Chinese Premier Li Qiang back in June. Mal, Australia's reliance on China for trade, it's quite sobering, isn't it? You know, as it looks like this economic Cold War between China and the US is set to continue now with Trump headed back to the White House, what is that going to mean for us?
Look, it puts Australia in a sticky situation. About 35% of Australia's exports go to China. We get about 25% of our imports from China. So we're clearly one of the most heavily China-dependent advanced economies out there. The thing is, we've been dancing this fine line between economic reliance on China and security reliance on the United States for many years now, and we've done it fairly well. On the trade front, an all-out US-China trade war, of course, is going to have some economic implications on Australia, just like it will on everyone. Then there's, of course, some financial market issues that we should think about as well. You know, if we think of some of the policies that Donald Trump has pledged, there's the tariffs, of course. That means higher prices in the United States. That equals higher inflation. There's those pledges to tighten up on immigration and, in fact, perhaps even lead to mass evictions of illegal immigrants. That reduces the labour pool, drives up wages, and equals higher inflation. There's the tax cuts. That means a bigger deficit. That means more inflation. So you put all that together, that should mean higher interest rates than otherwise in the United States, equaling a higher US dollar. So all of these things have financial implications as well as the trade implications. Now, on the security front, there's other considerations.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Australia has clearly lent more closely towards the US in recent years, as we've seen with, with things like the AUKUS submarine deal. How does this US election outcome play into Australia's security stance going forward?
Well, that AUKUS agreement is so important. Signed in 2021, it's a deal with the US and the UK where there's an agreement to collaborate on providing Australia with a fleet of nuclear power submarines. Now, will Donald Trump and his America First isolationism, will they sign on? Will his administration sign on to that deal and say yes? Or will the fact that it was the Biden administration under which this was agreed, will that be enough to sour him on it? So far in Canberra, there's a confidence that, no, the deal should proceed. And for one big reason, it's what Trump has called for in the past. Donald Trump was very critical of some allies, notably in Europe, in NATO, in his first presidency, because he was saying they're not spending enough on defence. Australia does plan to spend more on defence. It is paying its own way under AUKUS. So there is a confidence in Australia that perhaps those plans will continue with the Trump administration.
So, Mal, it has been an absolutely enormous week for politics. There really are few other events that grab the world's attention by the eyeballs like the US election does. But now the result is known and we await Trump's plans. How should we be thinking about Australia's relationship with the US and our biggest trading partner, China?
Prime Minister Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong have worked very hard to stabilise ties with China. I would doubt they want to see those go backwards just because of the US election result. I would suspect they want to avoid any renewal of the mini trade war that Australia had with China, where things like barley, wine, coal, seafood were all affected. But they can probably take some solace from the fact that overall, Australia went through that little trade war and survived it quite well, thanks largely to the quality of our coal exports and iron ore exports. So on the China front, there can be some confidence from Australian officials. On the US front, there's probably some consternation, just like there is right around the world, at the unpredictability of Donald Trump and, what that could mean for Australia's relations. But that's certainly not a challenge that's unique to Canberra.
And we'll be following along closely here at Bloomberg News. Mal, thanks for joining me. And thank you for listening to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. I'm Rebecca Jones. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Gadigal people of the Kulin and Eora Nation. It was produced by Paul Allen and edited by Chris Burke and Ainsley Chandler. Don't forget to follow and review the show wherever you get your podcasts and sign up to Bloomberg's free daily newsletter, Australia Briefing. Go to bloomberg.com to subscribe.